everybody, to the Seen and Heard podcast. Today, I have the privilege of speaking to Jonathan West. Since December 2023, Jonathan's been the director of Mandate Now, a pressure group that leads the agenda for the introduction of law requiring staff who work in regulated activities to report suspected or known sexual abuse of children to the local authority. Mandatory reporting is a vital component of an effective safeguarding system. He started getting involved in safeguarding campaigns in 2009 on learning that the monk, who had been the former headmaster of his son's primary school, had pleaded guilty to 11 counts of child sexual abuse. I'd like to start by introducing how we met, Jonathan. And we had met through Tom Perry, the previous director of Mandate Now, and some of the discussions that I've been having with him to try and solidify the Seen and Heard campaigning pledges, which include mandatory reporting and the removal of the limitation law for child sexual abuse civil claims, which is also progressing well. So that's how we met. But I'd love to say hi and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, it's wonderful. So just to get us started, I'd love to get a bit of background on you and how things were for you. So early years, what was family life like, and what brought you through to how we meet today?
Part of a big family, all very happy childhood. Not really a huge amount to say about that. I when I was at university, I met my first wife, who was a Catholic, which was how I sent my children to Catholic school, specifically my son to St Benedict's School in Ealing, which was where the headmaster. I actually met the monk who you spoke of at in the introduction a number of times. Of course, had no idea of anything about that at the time. I didn't learn about it until I read, quite by accident, much later on, about his conviction in the local paper. And so that's how it is that I got into all this campaigning stuff. I'd seen in the papers stories about the abuse scandals in America and in Ireland and elsewhere, and I sort of idly wondered, well, yeah, I wonder if it'll happen over here. But by over here, I thought in Britain somewhere, not at my son's school, which was really quite a shock when it got that close to home. And so I started digging around, started writing blog articles, started contacting the school and Ealing Abbey, and everything I learned made it all seem even worse.
Okay. No, thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. And what is it about your life up until that point, do you think, that gave you the kind of the skills or the ability to start to dig around and start to ask questions?
In my day job, for some time, I was in the telecoms industry, helping to write the standards for how mobile phones should work, which is lots of very detailed technical documents. So, and it's all got to be right, because there's nothing more useless than a phone that won't talk to the network it's supposed to be connected to. And I found that it was a transferable skill to looking at schools' child protection policies to see whether they were actually going to do what they were supposed to do. Once you learn the context and the new vocabulary, it's possible to look through those policies and say, no, this school is not really trying very hard.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we've seen cases recently where we've been looking at independent boarding schools, looking at their websites, trying to find safeguarding policies, trying to find anti-bullying policies. Often can't find them at all, or the ones that we're finding are, nowhere near acceptable. And so you have that ability to be able to dig into the detail, if you like, and get to the bottom of it. And I think for a lot of people, yeah, when they get long technical documents, they might glaze over a bit, but you have that ability to cut through. So
Yes.
amazing to apply that to this work. Mm. And so how did it move for you from looking into your son's school and the situation in your local area to now being the director of Mandate Now? What was the journey like from there?
Well, in fairly early on in the campaigning, Tom Perry got in touch with me, who was the founder of Mandate Now, and so we started working together on some more national issues as well. But also, it was simply the fact that there seemed to be very little that I could do to deal with the complete obstructiveness of the school and their complete unwillingness to reform their safeguarding policy so that to remove the discretion that they had as to whether they reported anything or not. It took me 4 years of solid campaigning to get them to change the policy. Um, and even after that, there's no way of actually telling whether they're following the policy. And that's at a school that has had 5 former members of staff convicted of child sex abuse crimes.
Goodness, yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear that, and how challenging that was just to get something which most people, I think, with the reporting of child sexual abuse, I think if you ask most people, they would say, well, of course um, it's a legal requirement to do that, to protect children. So it really is quite staggering in many ways that that isn't yet a law in England and Wales.
When I tell people, particularly parents of school-aged children, that there isn't a law, that in fact, with the law as it currently stands, their child's head teacher could actually witness a member of staff raping a pupil in the school changing rooms, and the head would have no legal obligation to say anything about it to anybody.
That is quite something, isn't it? And yeah, really, really quite shocking. And in your experience through your investigations, through the work that you've done, when either known or suspected abuse was occurring, what was the typical reporting process in schools, or institutions, or anywhere? What was that? What was happening when things were being uncovered?
It varies hugely between schools, of course, but if you take the example of my son's school, it seems to have been that the primary objective of everything was to maintain the school's reputation. That they couldn't openly admit to anybody having abused because parents would stop wanting to send their children there. And so the temptation is always move the member of staff to somewhere else where they can't do any where they hopefully can't do any harm, and persuade the parents, because if you're the headmaster of a big Catholic school, you're probably older than the parents. You're in a position of authority. You can make this story stick. Oh, it won't be in your child's best interest to have lots of strangers asking difficult questions about all of this. And so the parents are persuaded not to report, and the school can carry on as it was. And if it happens that it happens more than once, or more than one abuser gets involved, it becomes part of the natural um, part of the natural way of doing things, that the abusers have to be supported and the victims have to be minimized and kept quiet. Otherwise, the entire house of cards falls to the ground.
Mm. Yeah, thank you,
Um,
Jonathan, for explaining that. Yeah, that's
um,
something we see an awful lot in the sector that we operate in, boarding and independent schools. Reputation is above all else, and the safeguarding of jobs, job security, if you like, for heads, for boards, for teachers. Um, yeah, and you say as businesses, many of them are, the reputation of the institution is paramount. And so that kind of inwards and upwards reporting, if you like, to your line manager, to your, a member of the senior leadership team, or to the up to the board, and then the squashing of it, the minimizing of it. We hear from abuse survivors time and time again that the most heartbreaking and painful part of the experience was to report to the school, or to contact the school later on as an adult, and to be effectively be gaslit and minimized, often by the school plus lawyers plus insurers, and basically be told, well, so you're the only one. This doesn't really happen. So, are you sure you're not making it all up? Are you sure you remember it correctly? Yeah, that's abuse on top of abuse, if you like. So, is that your experience?
Yes, I mean, you can see how it might get started, that they genuinely believe that they are doing good works, and that they don't want anything to get in the way of their ability to do good works. So it's easy to see how they fall into this trap. But once they've fallen into it, it's desperately difficult to climb back out, because each lie requires a further lie to cover for it. The insurers, of course, want to find ways of not paying claims. They don't want to pay claims that are unjustified, and I mean the insurance companies are in it for the money as well. And so, yes, it's really very easy to see how this sort of thing happens, and how people's moral universe just gets completely warped by the whole thing.
Yeah, I can understand that. Once something has been covered once, or once an offender, member of staff, gets moved on to another institution or school or area or something like that, there's almost no going back. Then the lie has to be maintained all the way through, because otherwise someone's going to be responsible for that original decision, and so the house of cards comes down, as you say.
With larger institutions, of course, moving them may well mean moving them within the institution, within, let's say, the churches. And so then the abusers have to be publicly supported, because not to support them would be to give credence to the rumours that would inevitably by then be going round. Perfectly true rumours, but they don't want to admit that they're true. So additional support, very public, very very deliberate, has to be provided, and that, I'm sure, is even more hurtful to the survivors.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we've sort of touched on this idea that there isn't a legal or legislative framework for enforcing the reporting of known or suspected sexual abuse of a child. So just to talk, when people say mandatory reporting, it's not necessarily a term that most people are going to understand. What do you see as mandatory reporting, and what is good mandatory reporting?
Mandatory reporting basically is that if you're working or volunteering in an institution that looks after children, school, children's home, hospital, whatever, and you know or suspect child sexual abuse is happening or has happened, then mandatory reporting is that you have a legal obligation, with some kind of criminal sanction, to tell the authorities about it. It's not for you to investigate it, just to report it, so that those in authority, with the training and authority to do something about it, know about it, so that they can act to protect the child.
Thank you, Jonathan. And who is that? So who is the right? Where does reporting go to? Let's say from an institution outwards.
Generally to the local authority children's services. Most local authorities have what's known as a LADO, the local authority designated officer for child protection. So in the report should go to the LADO, and everybody working with children ought to be receiving training as to what they should do and who they should report to.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that very much flies in the face of kind of the old business model of suspicions being kept within the school, within the institution, wherever it may be, with them making its way to management levels where decisions are made for the greater good, if you like, for the good of the institution, and then things are suppressed, moved around, or dealt with as kind of quickly and cleanly as possible, as they would see it. Um, but perhaps not thoroughly or with the right skill set that the LADOs and the local authorities would have.
Interestingly, Britain is an outlier in this respect. About 80% of countries worldwide have a mandatory reporting law for child sexual abuse. The laws vary from place to place, but they all bear a fairly strong resemblance to each other. Interestingly, we do have a law for mandatory reporting, but not of child sex abuse. We have a law where financial institutions have a legal obligation to report suspected money laundering. So curiously, we in Britain protect our money more than our children.
Well, that's quite a statement. But I do remember when that came in, I was working in the property industry, I think, and money laundering and property were quite close, close bedfellows, particularly in London, because a lot of money was being washed through the property market. And there was a huge amount of noise and fear of of all the paperwork and all the work it would create and all the false reports that might come out, and how it would bring the system to a halt. But it didn't seem to do that for money laundering. But is that something that you hear from people who are not supportive of mandatory reporting for sexual
Exactly,
abuse?
those fears are being expressed uh, concerning mandatory reporting for child sex abuse. Yes, I mean, and one of the points that I'm trying to press to counter this is that, first of all, it hasn't happened in other countries that have already introduced mandatory reporting, and it didn't happen here when we introduced mandatory reporting for money laundering. The system did cope.
So there isn't actually a precedent set for it, bringing the system down or causing major hassles. So these are ungrounded fears, would you say?
Well, if you were to write a mandatory reporting law in a very, very stupid way, then yes, you could probably provoke enough reports to overwhelm the system. All you would need to do would be to make the penalty for non-reporting unreasonably high, the threshold for reporting unreasonably low, and apply it to members of the public as well as those trained and working with children. That way, yes, you could you could devise a mandatory reporting law that made a complete mess of the system, but hopefully nobody would be stupid enough to do that.
I, I hear you on that one. So if that's what not to do when designing a mandatory reporting system, what to do then? So what does good look like?
Yeah. First thing you've got to realize is that everybody fondly believes that they would, of course, instantly report concerns if they had them. The public are baffled by the idea that people don't report. That fond belief lasts until the instant you're faced with the prospect of actually having to do it. And at that point, horrible doubts creep in. What if I'm wrong? What if what I've seen it has an innocent explanation? What if I'm going to wreck the career of an innocent person? What if I'm going to actually be accused of making a malicious allegation? And because there's not been an investigation at this stage, the evidence isn't necessarily terribly clear. And so it's very, very easy to persuade yourself that there's actually nothing to report. And so you don't report anything. And that's why an awful lot of people don't report. The ICSA public inquiry into child sexual abuse documented literally dozens of cases of repeat offenders who hadn't been reported because nobody quite felt able to. Now, that's the self. So the first stage is getting over the self-censorship issue. Then the second stage is institutions that are hostile to reporting out. Boarding schools, churches, all sorts of institutions. If their leadership has come to the conclusion that their reputation matters more than the children, this can happen. You'll get a potential whistleblower being told, if you know what's good for you, keep your head down and do your job. So these are the two things that a mandatory reporting law has to get passed. It's not to prosecute people who don't report. It's to make it clear to the ordinary, well-meaning, law-abiding people who work with children what is the right thing to do. In just the same way as we introduced a law on wearing seatbelts, because people are in fact safer wearing seatbelts. We had in the years before the introduction of the seatbelt laws, lots of public information films, Click Every Trip, presented by Jimmy Savile of all people. And it had almost no effect on the number of people who wore seatbelts, and people would express concerns. Oh, well, what if the car overturns and I'm strangled by my seatbelt? It was exactly the same sorts of unfounded concerns, but when a law was passed, everyone just buckled up. And a mandatory reporting law, we know from experience in other countries, would achieve the same sort of thing. So that's why there has to be a law with some degree of criminal sanction, just to make sure that people know what is the right thing to do. Now, it doesn't need to be a terribly onerous criminal sanction. A fine is perfectly good enough. And it needs to be very clear who you report to, that you're reporting out to the authorities, not upwards within your own institution. And the other thing is that different countries have different systems in terms of of precisely what gets reported, what sorts of things have to be reported. It's quite important that it's limited only to child sexual abuse, not other forms of child abuse. America has had other forms of child abuse on mandatory reporting, and they found, including neglect and things like that, and they found that poor and ethnic minority families were overly criminalized as a result. So child sex abuse needs this because of the secret nature of the abuse. It's done in private without witnesses. And so you don't want to do too much, but you also don't want to do too little. It's important that if you witness abuse, of course, that's got to be reported. If the child says something, of course, it's also got to be reported. But in fact, very, very few children tell somebody in authority. Very few children tell a teacher or whoever. And so, but there's often other signs. It might be that an adult is behaving suspiciously. It might be that there's medical evidence. It might be that there might be behavioral evidence. The child is using age-inappropriate sexual language, for instance. Or how do they learn those words? Or they make a sort of half admission of something, or even slightly accidentally. All these are what you could term reasonable grounds for suspecting that abuse has happened. And because children mostly don't say out sort of directly, all those need to go to the authorities so that it can be properly looked into and the child protected. The first objective is always to protect the child.
Mm-hmm. And that's a huge difference from protecting the institution, actually putting the
Yes.
child at the heart of things. And I think
Yes.
the amazing developmental psychologist Suzanne Zidai often talks about, you mentioned the seatbelt law there, that she mentions that whenever there is a law change proposed that affects children or parenting or the care of children, it is always vociferously fought. And there just seems to be something about that in this country around young people kind of being second-class citizens and not being put at the heart of these processes. There seems to be something that, amongst the adults and the institutions themselves that are prioritized ahead of the safety and the needs of the child. So this kind of mandatory reporting you talk about turns that on its head.
And once the law is passed, people do get used to it. I'm in contact with senior educators in New South Wales in Australia who have had mandatory reporting since 1987, and they are completely gobsmacked that we don't have it yet. Because it's as much a normal part of of the scenery to them as wearing a seatbelt is to us.
And my understanding, Jonathan, thank you for sharing that. My understanding is it is, you said, in place in 80% of the countries in the world in some form or another. What is it? And it's in place in Scotland, is that correct? Not
No,
yet.
no,
So,
nowhere in the UK.
so the UK entirely then doesn't have it. What do you put that down to? Why have we tiptoed around this? And because I know that you and Tom, your predecessor, Tom Perry, you have been fighting for this for so long. Um, why is it something that people would assume as being in place? Why is Britain held out?
Uh, that's a question that you would perhaps have to direct to government rather than me. I can speculate to a certain extent. Um, I think that there are, as it were, two forms of fear that are here. One is that instituting a mandatory reporting law would result in a flood of trivial reports, which would require so much resource to wade through that children's services wouldn't actually be able to protect children in real instances of abuse. And the other is that actually it might be that child sex abuse is actually so widespread that putting in a law to report it would result in so many reports that children's services would actually get overwhelmed. And to be incredibly cynical about it, you don't have to be responsible for children you don't know about.
It's very sad.
Um, and of course, looking after children does cost money. But the interesting thing is that in the long run, it would probably save a lot of money.
This is it, Jonathan. Thank you for raising that because the impact seen and heard, we see many of our stakeholders, of our service users who were sexually abused as children, often in the schools that they attended. The impacts in adulthood are vast. Mental health, physical health, um, just the lost lives, the lost opportunities, and unfulfilled potential is because is the big one because they're the psychological effect of being sexually abused as a child creates a huge level of dissociation to get through the experience and then to live with it, the shame that comes with it, the inability to trust the people around you, and those are the kind of things that form a survival personality, if you like, that can go on then, for decades and decades, and inevitably, sadly, is likely to shorten a life, is likely to mean that life is less fulfilled. So what you're saying there is that actually, if there is a cost up front, it's going to be paid back via the NHS, via mental health services, or via
Exactly so.
gross
I mean,
domestic product, for income. And
I mean, it's, I mean, there's a number of ways in which there are savings. First of all, an effective preventive measures with mandatory reporting a key component of it. If abusers get caught early, they won't have the chance to abuse as many children. And so there'll be a whole group of people who don't get abused at all, which is obviously a good thing. Second, if you if you catch someone early, the harm to and the child is believed early and action is taken early, I understand that the harm is actually quite a lot less if support and treatment is provided early.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, if you're getting if I mean, child abusers are criminals just like everybody else. They just like all other criminals. There's nothing that deters a criminal from committing a crime more than a perceived certainty that they'll get caught. And if you have a culture of vigilance in schools and elsewhere, looking after children, then um, those who might be that way inclined will not dare to try it on because they know that they'll get caught. And so you after a mandatory reporting law gets introduced, you might, after you get an initial spike, get it sort of flushing the existing abusers out of the system, the long-term reporting rate might not be as much higher than it is now as one might imagine, because it'll be based on a lower underlying crime rate. So you've got fewer children being abused, you've got less lifelong psychological harms being done, more people able to contribute to the economy, to contribute meaningfully to society. I mean, it quite apart from just being the right thing to do, it's a win-win situation all around.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, it seems to be always that it takes so very long for prevention in any area to actually sort of come in and be the norm. You know, and now we can say that preventative measures for physical health are becoming relatively normal. We know that if doctors intervene early and look at diet and exercise and stress levels and things like that, then we can bring the rate of heart rates or cancer down. But it seems to take an awfully long time to get to that point. We've kind of put sticky plasters on bullet holes for a very long time, kind of focusing on the output of these kind of harms, long before we even try and swim upstream and put preventative measures in place. So this sounds very healthy. Um,
Interestingly, in a recent debate in the House of Lords, Lord Mann, John Mann, who used to be an MP before, um, described how when he first became an MP, he conducted a survey within his constituency of the heroin addicts. And he spoke to about half the heroin addicts in his constituency. And without exception, every single one of them had had a major childhood trauma of some kind or another, many of them being child sexual abuse. Not all of them, but so if you can avoid those kinds of childhood trauma or reduce the number of people that have them, you have a major effect on the number of people going into drug dependency.
yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, with trauma, it's not always what happens to you; it's what you make it mean.
Yes.
And if the effect of being sexually abused as a child, you make it mean that you are of little value, that you can be used by people around you, you are dirty, you are defective in some way. Those are the kind of beliefs that stay, and until you do some fairly significant healing work. And in my coaching work, I deal um, with those beliefs, and they are always from childhood. That I'm no good as I am. I am not worthy. Other people are more important than me. And these beliefs drive a whole life. Now, they don't always drive people into drug addiction, dependency, and issues, but they will always leave a mark. And so, yeah, so getting things early, the mandatory reporting, bringing the level of offenders down in the system, getting young people help quickly, so that those beliefs, those trauma marks and memories and beliefs don't get imprinted, um, for as long, uh, gives us a net positive outcome in society, and most importantly for that individual. So it seems like very important work that you're doing, trying to get this out there. Um, so with that being said, we understand now a little bit more about mandatory reporting, about what makes what makes a good mandatory reporting system. You touched on ICSA earlier, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse. And I believe in that. One of the big findings was that it takes 25 plus years for child sexual abuse often to be uncovered, if you like, or to see the light of day. Um, how was your experience with ICSA, and with that statistic or that idea, if you like, that it takes so long to report?
Well, I think that yes, they did mention 26 years as sort of an estimate of the average time it takes for somebody to come for a child sex abuse victim to come forward. Now, a report that is 26 years late is pretty useless for safeguarding purposes. Just imagine how many other children the abuser might have harmed in the meantime. And a prosecution of a crime that's 26 years old is extremely difficult and expensive to conduct. I mean, it's a real mess. So one of the 20 recommendations in the final report of the public inquiry was mandatory reporting. And I was very, very pleased to see it, because it was the first time a British official institution had actually come out in favour of mandatory reporting. Previous consultations by the Home Office had always concluded that no, they didn't want it. So, but there was a problem with the ICSA recommendation, which was that they got it nearly right. They said that they needed to be a criminal sanction. They said that they needed to apply to child sexual abuse, but they only said that it needed to apply to witnessed abuse or disclosures of abuse, either by the perpetrator or by the child. Now, the perpetrator doesn't disclose because out of a sense of self-preservation. On average, if it takes 26 years for a child to come forward, only a very, very small proportion are going to come forward while they are still children. And so a mandatory reporting law limited to that is going to generate very, very few mandated reports. And everybody else who's still working, who sees suspicions, remains an unprotected whistleblower. And they'll be no more willing to come forward with expressing concerns than they are now. So they got it nearly right, but they just said it would be too complicated to have a mandatory reporting law for suspicions of abuse. Quite how they came to that conclusion they didn't say, because there was nothing in the report that would support that, especially as they already knew that other countries, notably Australia, had already introduced mandatory reporting laws, including for suspected abuse, and that they had taken evidence from Professor Ben Matthews from Queensland, who is the world's leading academic on the effect of mandatory reporting laws on reporting rates. And he made it absolutely clear that you do need to do it properly. In response to one particular question, he actually said, is bad public policy to put in place a model that you know is not as good as another? So that was, I mean, in a way, the ICSA recommendation was good, and in a way it was incredibly frustrating, because it was mandatory reporting, but it wasn't actually a well-designed mandatory reporting law, because it wouldn't really have that much effect.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And my understanding is, so it was good to see it on there as one of the 20 recommendations. Good to see it finally being acknowledged, but it wouldn't have been an effective model, nor would it have been. There's plenty of good models out there in the world now to borrow from. You mentioned Australia, you mentioned Queensland, and I know there are others as well which you can mention. But yeah, so it was there, but two and a half years on almost from ICSA. 250 million upwards of taxpayers' money spent on the inquiry, and until Christmas this year, really, Christmas 2024, nothing was happening. And we work with yourselves, the Survivors Trust, the LSPCC, ICSA Changemakers, and the Act on ICSA, the Survivors Trust campaigns, and survivors, charities, campaigners were livid that nothing had been done for 2 years. And then
Yes.
yeah.
So yes, I mean the Conservative government, as it was then, took 7 months to produce a substantive response to the inquiry report, and their response, when you read the written statement in response, you found that in effect that they had rejected 5 of the 20 recommendations outright. They had sort of accepted in principle another 8, but had promised no tangible action as a result. They basically said, we agree with the need for this in principle, and we're going to carry on doing exactly what we're doing now. Another 5, they said, well, we're not going to do anything right now because we feel that there is a need for more public consultation about it before we do anything. And mandatory reporting was in that category. And the last 2, they inaccurately claimed were already in hand. They were to do with online harms. They were already in hand in the online safety bill that was then going through Parliament. But the online safety bill wasn't doing things the way that the recommendations were suggesting. So effectively, the government had basically said, we are doing absolutely nothing. Now, they did in fact then have a couple of consultations on mandatory reporting, and just before the general election, they brought forward a proposed mandatory reporting law, which they themselves knew would have no effect. And we know that because they produced an impact assessment which estimated that the number of additional reports would be a rise of between 1% and 3%. Put that into simple numbers, something like between 2 and 6 additional reports per local authority per year. I mean, it's nothing. And they knew that that was the effect that they were expecting, because they said so themselves. Now, the law itself was even more useless. It was greatly watered down, even compared to the ICSA recommendation, in that there was no criminal sanction. The government said that they wanted to make arrangements for people to instead to be reported to the DBS, the Disclosure and Barring Service, but the legislation didn't actually contain a mechanism for doing that. And there was a very stiff apparent law on discouraging people from making a mandated report. But there was a huge get out in it, a huge loophole, which was that it was perfectly acceptable to persuade people to delay reporting, and didn't give any limit to how long that delay could be. So it looked very much to me as if it was designed to achieve nothing at all, except to be able to put a headline in the paper saying the government is introducing mandatory reporting.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That sounds like it was I heard the lawyer Dino Nocciavone talk about it as a chocolate teapot of a policy. And then sort of fast forward then to this Christmas 2024. Strange goings on with the world's richest man, Elon Musk, starting to get involved in kind of British political discourse. And before we know it, things are changing. So can you tell me how things are right now for mandatory reporting process in your work?
A bit before that, Baroness Tanni-Grey-Thompson got lucky in the ballot for private members' bills, and chose to have mandatory reporting as the subject of her bill. And we had a well-designed bill already available because it had been through the process once before a couple of years ago, but didn't get anywhere through lack of parliamentary time. And so she brought it in, and quite soon after the election last year, it did, and it got its second reading, first debate in the House of Lords last month in January, and everybody who spoke in the debate spoke very much in favour of the bill. And the government announced that, between the bill being first tabled and the second reading, all the Elon Musk thing blew up, and the government announced that they were going to implement all 20 of the recommendations, and that the Home Office and that the 3 of the recommendations that were solely within the remit of the Home Office, because a lot of the recommendations dealt with sort of cross-departmental issues, the 3 that were solely within the remit of the Home Office, including mandatory reporting, would get implemented in the basically the next bill to come along. The Home Office is due to be bringing out a criminal justice bill fairly soon. And they said, we will implement the ICSA recommendation in the criminal justice bill. Now, that's a problem to me because the ICSA recommendation is flawed. And I've been trying to find out from government whether they're actually going to go beyond the ICSA recommendation to properly well-designed mandatory reporting, and I haven't really got a straight answer out of them yet.
Thank you, Jonathan. So whilst there is good momentum and amazing work from Tandy Gray-Thompson there to get that bill through to win the ballot, perhaps these things happen for a reason, not always just luck. So this is important, won the ballot, things are starting to progress. But what is your fear now? And what would you like to see happen, given there is some momentum, but it could easily kind of get steamrolled to this ICSA version of mandatory reporting, which is not what you want?
My fervent hope is that the government will decide to do it properly. If they do, then the campaign's over. We've won. I'm being slightly flippant. The mandatory reporting is not a magic bullet. It's something that it won't solve the entire problem by itself. There are other issues like the proper resourcing of children's services and all that kind of stuff that also needs to be done. Training schemes need to be set up, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the legislative aspect of it, yeah, the campaign would be won if they did it properly. Now, my great fear is that for whatever political reason, they will only do ICSA and exclude suspected abuse from the mandatory reporting law, in which case we're not actually much further forward than we are now, because so few children disclose abuse. And that then we'll be stuck for years and years because people will say, well, we don't want to go any further until we've seen the effect of what we've done already.
So it's now or never. Yeah.
And that when we know already from really high quality academic studies and statistical analysis that has been done, particularly with very, very good data in Australia, we know what a good mandatory reporting law can achieve, and we know what it needs to consist of. And so it'll be hugely frustrating if we don't get it right after so long cogitating about it.
Yeah. So it's for clarity, it's the Tandy Gray-Thompson private members bill version and not the ICSA version of mandatory reporting. And that key difference is making sure that the suspicion of is within it.
Yes. I mean, there's one additional element which in the Tandy Gray-Thompson bill, which is also very important, which is that those doing mandated reports in good faith are protected from any kind of retaliation. That you won't get disciplined, you won't get sacked for the sin of doing the right thing. At the moment where there's no mandatory reporting, it's very, very easy for an inconvenient whistleblower to be turfed out of their job or even drummed out of their profession. It has happened. I know I know I've spoken to people to whom it has happened. Um, and so that's the two key things are protecting uh, reports in good faith. I mean, nobody wants to protect someone who makes a malicious report, but if you've made a report in good faith, you genuinely are concerned, you've got this basis for your concern, then you should be perfectly safe. And the other thing is, it's got to include these reasonable grounds for suspicion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the clarity. Um, what's your What's your view then on what comes next? Appreciate you haven't got a crystal ball, but I know you're having meetings with the right people, and there is clearly momentum behind this, political momentum to kind of do ICSA, mandatory reporting being part of that. What, is there anything you want to say to people listening, to the powers that be, other than it's the the Tanni Gray Thompson version, not the ICSA version? You've got a chance to get this right. Otherwise, we'll be many years down the line, kind of waiting to see results of something that was designed to fail effectively. Is there anything else you want to say or that you need to see next?
I think the one other thing to say to the people who are in charge of producing the legislation is just courage. People will get used to this. People will accept it in a little bit of time. The noise will die down. The news cycle will move on to something else. They're going to get complaints about this from various people anyway, so they might as well get complained at for doing it right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And
Yeah,
and like I said, in Australia, they're flabbergasted that we don't do it already. That
I've heard the
we are
same.
so backwards in this respect.
Yeah.
But of course, because there's a certain amount of British exceptionalism about everything, it's very hard for those in authority in Britain to actually believe that anywhere else in the world they do things better. Because we're British, we do things best by definition.
Yeah, there might be that arrogance there. I think I heard somewhere that as a nation we'd had more consultations than virtually any other country on the planet, and done less with the output of all of those consultations than anywhere else on the planet. And we seem to like to keep lots of people employed in these consultations, but not actually heed what they teach us and put it into effect. So let's be positive, and that the Tanni Gray Thompson version, the private members bill version of mandatory reporting comes in, the legislation starts to move, and then the system goes with it, the training programs, and the communications out, to the wider world, to the people who work with young people. So
I
this
mean,
is
the training programs wouldn't actually be terribly hard to do, for at least for the training programs for the mandated reporters. I mean, I my day job, I work in the financial services industry. Just today, I was undergoing some repeat in-service training on the mandatory reporting for money laundering duty. It's not hard. It took me half an hour. It was all online. It's really. I mean, I could almost in half a day rewrite the script, putting child sexual abuse instead of money laundering, and just use exactly the same program.
yeah, yeah,
It really is as easy as that.
yeah, and it's protecting our children as much as we protect our money. Seems like a pretty shameful thing not to have done so far. So um, let's be positive. Let's believe that they're going to get it right this time and be brave. I think that there's been a lot of we're here in mid-February 2025, and there's been a real blowback this week with the church side, the church abuse with the synod meeting, and not um, choosing option four, fully independent safeguarding. And campaigners felt that was, despite everything that's been stirred up in the media around this and a real forward momentum, that particular one kind of sort of they backed off it right at the final
Yeah,
hurdle of doing the
I
right thing.
I was very disappointed, but wholly unsurprised by that, because, of course, the church has had its own problems with safeguarding. It has had its own problems with cover-up. The senior people within the church, I suspect, have been thoroughly infected with this habit of thought that I described earlier of we must, in order to protect the ability of the church to continue doing good works, keep the abuse quiet. To the point where those who try to whistleblow, those who try to raise concerns, are treated as the enemy. And it's doubly hard for the churches because they like to think of themselves as being, by definition, the good guys.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an ongoing battle, I know, for campaigners to try and get institutions to do the right thing. We cannot rely on, sadly, on people doing the right thing. So there has to be a legal framework around this now. And you've very clearly and very passionately put that across for mandatory reporting today. On the mandatory reporting subject, is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything else you want there to be out there? Do you want action from people? What is it that you want right now?
I want to see the law passed, and I want to see it incorporated into an effective framework. Because I think that a huge amount of good can be done and a huge amount of harm can be prevented. So, I mean, that's really the key thing above all else. I mean,
can listeners do anything, Jonathan? I know that before Christmas, so December 2024, we looked at letter writing to MPs.
I think that given that the criminal justice bill will be coming out fairly soon, anybody interested in this subject who wants to see this put in place effectively, yes, do please write to your MP and ask for support for the Tanny Gray Thompson bill, or for the government to introduce the same measures in its own bill, particularly including mandatory reporting for suspected abuse. I think the more MPs are sensitive to what their constituents write to them. If a bunch of letters on this subject comes to an MP, they do actually take notice because they like to get re-elected.
Thank you, Jonathan. For anyone interested in writing to MPs, you can go to Seen and Heard, to our news and blog section, and you will find a blog about campaigning for mandatory reporting, and you'll be able to access MP details and find a templated letter there for anyone interested. So the fight's not done yet, but huge thanks to you, to Tom Perry, to all the other campaigners. I know Alex Renton and many others, Michael Corston, have been really passionately supporting this, Piers Cross, and it feels like it's time. The challenge I have when I speak to teachers, friends, social workers, police, and I mention mandatory reporting, that there is a fear, there is a reluctance there, and it's around um, the whistleblowing. Will I lose my job? Will I, will my career be affected? What about spurious reports? What if I get it wrong? Those are all the things that come to mind. So the basic fear is the blocker. Is there anything, last thought, you would say to anyone who's a good, well-meaning professional who works with young people who is scared of this?
The fear actually is a proof that we need this, because the fear, it means that not mandated, they're not reporting now. We know that they're not reporting now, or a lot of people aren't reporting now because of the data that was collected by the ICSA public inquiry. So we need to get over that fear, and we know that the fear is unfounded because of what has happened in other countries which already have mandatory reporting. We will get used to this. There is nothing to fear. we need to protect the children.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a great way to conclude, our discussion about mandatory reporting. Thank you again for your amazing work, and the work of your organisation, Tom Perry, Mandate Now, and others. So just to how I like to finish things off, just want to ask you a couple of kind of different questions, just to get a real sense of Jonathan West. There's one, what have you changed your mind on most in the last few years, and why? Is there a revelation that's come from your personal life, your work, your journey?
I think when I first started getting involved in this, I shared the general public assumption of, well, of course people will report. And it's been a big shock and a huge disappointment to me to discover that, that they don't. And worse still, there are institutions who are actively against this getting reported and children being protected. That was really quite a shock, and a huge disappointment.
Yeah, I can see a lot of sadness, a lot of disappointment. It's almost the sort of humanity element, isn't it, that it can shake our beliefs in the goodness of people. But I think, if people are good, inherently good. Institutions, unfortunately, once you put the institutional framework around it, can often just lose that kind of humanity. But people on the whole being good, but groups of them, institutions can get lost in their own stuff, I think. So, yeah, but thank you for sharing that. And is there anything you want people to know about you or set the record straight on?
Interestingly, in the earlier days of my campaigning, when I was looking particularly at Ealing Abbey and St Benedict's School, quite frequently I was accused of being anti-Catholic, being motivated by anti-Catholicism, wanting to bring down the Catholic Church. The headmaster of the school actually used his prize-giving day speech to accuse me of anti-Catholic motivations. That I was hell-bent on separating the school from the abbey. But the fact is that had it been a secular school, I'd have campaigned in exactly the same way, because the children, I mean, I'm not concerned whether the children are Catholics or Protestants or atheists or whatever. They're children and they need protecting. And quite frankly, if people insist on calling me anti-Catholic, I'll wear that badge with pride. Because if to be pro-Catholic means to support the abusers over the children, I'm anti-abuse. If they want to equate being anti-abuse with being anti-Catholic, then okay, yeah, that's how you want to do it. That's how it'll be. If you want to be pro-Catholic and equate that with being pro-abuse and pro-abusers, that's absolutely fine by me.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for those final thoughts, and a huge thanks from me personally for the support you've given to Seen and Heard and our understanding on this topic, and has allowed us to try and support in the way we can with campaigning, and from my understanding, and also just for sticking up for kids, for young people. I think young people get a raw deal in this country. They're second-class citizens, and often other things are prioritised ahead of them. So I'm very proud to see someone really fighting for young people. So bless you for your work, and good luck for the ongoing fight. And let's hope to see the right version of mandatory reporting in place in this country in the near future.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been a pleasure, Jonathan. Take good care, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much for watching.